Beloved students of honors first year, take my heartiest greetings and appreciation for continuing your studies in these days of global crisis. You know, we are stuck at home, facing a very uncertain future starting now, and none of us can predict what comes next or what will happen tomorrow. Besides, COVID 19 has totally changed the way education is delivered from face to face to online. But remember, the world has been through rough times before. We had famines, diseases, terrorist attacks, etc., and we all came out stronger and better. So try to adjust and cope up with the situation. I'm certain that you will be better prepared than any other people. Dear students, as you know me, I am Joydev Dotto, lecturer in English, Government Brojolal College, Khulna. Now I welcome you to my second virtual class for you. Today I shall discuss a poem by one of the leading 19th century American poets, Emily Elizabeth Dickinson, popularly known as Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson is one of the America's greatest and most original poets of all time. She has written nearly 1800 poems, and she is known for her bold original verses. Okay, dear students, let's have a glance at what I shall discuss today. Today, I shall discuss the biography of Emily Dickinson in brief, critical appreciation of the poem Because I Could Not Stop for Death, poetic techniques and devices used in this poem, and finally, themes of this poem. First of all, let's discuss the biography of Emily Dickinson in brief. Under biography, I shall discuss birth and childhood, education, development as a poet, and finally death. Emily Dickinson was born in December 10, 1830 in a prominent family in Amherst, Massachusetts, USA. Her father, Edward Dickinson, was a lawyer, a politician, and a trustee of Amherst College. Her grandfather, Samuel Dickinson, was a founding member of that college. Dear students, if you study the biography of Emily Dickinson, you will learn that from the childhood she was very pleasant, well behaved, who particularly loved music. Dickinson received more rigorous classical education than any other girls of that time because of her father's strong desire to educate his daughters. As an excellent student, she was educated at Amherst College, the then Amherst Academy, for 7 years, and then attended Mount Holyoke Female Seminary for a year. She studied literature, science, history, philosophy, and Latin. Next, development as a poet. Dickinson read extensively, helped by friends and family who brought her more books. Among her most favorite influences was the work of Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Emerson, Charlotte Bronte, etc. She became ill at the spring of her first year at Mount Holyoke Seminary when she was only 18. Then she left the institution and did not return there. Later, she started to cut off from the outside world because of her mother's illness and the devastating deaths in her family and relations. She learned more into her inner world, and thus her creative output, her poetry deals with identity of self, death, immortality, etc., which I shall discuss in the later part of this lecture. Dickinson died in May 15, 1886. That's all about the biography of the poet Emily Dickinson in brief. Dear students, now I shall discuss the poem, but before that, let's look at some pictures. Have a look at this picture. Dear students, what can you see in the picture? Yes, you can clearly see a ghostly creature is calling somebody who is standing in front of a graveyard. Okay, what do we think first when we think of a graveyard? Of course, we think of death first. Now, let's have a look at another picture. Again, what can you see here? That ghostly creature of this early picture had just got down from his horse-drawn carriage and inviting a lady to be with him in his journey. You see, that lady looks like she is unmindful, probably busy with her own thoughts. Okay, dear students, let's look at the next picture. You see, that ghostly creature, along with the lady, is going somewhere, riding the horse carriage, and they are going along the road beside a green field. Now look at two more pictures. Yes, you see in the fourth picture, they are riding along the road, and beside the road, some school children are playing. And in the fifth picture, you see the nature in its evening as the sun is setting. Now look at the last picture. You see, they have reached near a graveyard. So, dear students, let's try to compare the incidents of the picture. You see, this is a story of a journey, much like the story of the journey depicted in the poem Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. Now, let's go to the poem. Dear students, look at the title of the poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. As you can see, death is the main subject of the poem. In fact, death is one of the favorite subjects of Dickinson. However, the word because here gives the connotation of cause and explanations. The poem is one of the most celebrated poems of Emily Dickinson. It depicts the story of how a speaker was visited by death and was taken for a symbolic ride in his carriage. The journey is much like the journey you have noticed in the earlier pictures. Actually, Because I Could Not Stop for Death is not the original title of this poem. Emily Dickinson did not title any of her poems because she never meant to publish them. Her poems were collected or recorded in numbers. So, after her death, this name has been titled by the editors. Okay, dear students, let's go to the poem. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. This is the first stanza. Look at the picture of carriage. Here, the first person speaker, I, tells us about death, personified like a kindly gentleman or a driver who has stopped to pick up the speaker. The speaker could not stop for death. Maybe she was occupied with various worldly activities, duties, responsibilities, etc. So death graciously came to take her. The speaker climbed the carriage with death and immortality or eternal life, which has also been personified here. Through this symbolic journey, the poet indicates that immortality or eternal life is the concept of living in physical or spiritual form for an infinite length of time. Let's look at the second stanza of the poem. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my lever and my leisure too, for his civility. Here the speaker says that death, the speaker, and immortality drove unhurriedly, or in no rush. She had left all her work and pleasures behind, in order to be respectful of the courtesy or gentlemanly nature of death. We can also understand that the speaker has no fear of death. Death is kind, drives with care, and has a formal politeness. Here, the optimistic poet wants to indicate that death is not to be feared because it is a part of endless cycle of nature. Now, next look at the third stanza. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of grazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Here, recess means interval or break between class time. Look at the picture at at children playing in the ring, fields of grazing green and setting sun. Here, death, the speaker, and immortality went by a school where children played during their break time. Then they passed fields of crops and sunset. Here, children at recess symbolizes the beginning of a life, means the speaker's life. The fields of grazing grain symbolize adolescence or adulthood, and setting sun symbolizes her final years. Next, the fourth stanza. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew, quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. Dear students, just have a look at the pictures. You will be able to understand that tippet, tulle and gossamer are veil, scarf and delicate dresses for women or girl. In these stanza, the poet wants to indicate that they did not pass the sun, rather the sun passed them. As it did so, dew formed, shivering and cold. The speaker got cold too, as she was only wearing a thin gown and a lightweight scarf. The sun is personified here. It falls below the horizon. Through these lines, Dickinson suggests what's death like. The sun, the light and warmth leave us to the cold darkness which is death. Next, the fifth stanza. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Look at the pictures. The house is actually a grave here. Cornice is a decoration inside the roof. So next, they stopped at the place that looked like a house, which was partly buried in the ground. The speaker could just about to see the roof. Even the ceiling was inside the ground. The poet consciously uses the word house to indicate grave or place of burial. Grave has been to consider synonymous with dwelling or final resting place. Okay, dear student, next look at the last stanza. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than a day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Since that day, centuries have passed. It feels as though less than a day has gone by since then, the day that I realized that death's horses were headed in the direction of eternity. It also seems she herself is already dead. The lines can be read as an anticipation of afterlife. Dear students, now I shall discuss the poetic techniques and devices employed in this poem. In this section, I shall provide you an overview of the use of figures of speeches, form of the poem, and Dickinson's style. Under figures of speech, I shall show you the use of personifications, metaphors, symbols, and imagery. Under form and meter, I shall discuss the poem's type, stanza structure, line lengths, and rhyme scheme. And under Dickinson's style, I shall show you the use of unconventional punctuation marks, especially capitalization and dashes, broken rhyme scheme, and metaphors. So let's discuss figures of speech. You know, figures of speech are words or phrases that have other meaning than their ordinary meaning. They rely on implied or suggested meaning. There are various types of figures of speech. Now I shall discuss the major uses of personifications, metaphors, symbols, and imagery. Let's start with personification. Personification is the act of giving human qualities or characteristics to something which is not human. I think you already know that. Here in the first line, Death has been personified as a kindly gentleman. In the fourth line also, the very concept of immortality or eternal life has been personified. Who rides on a carriage with the speaker? In the fifth line, he indicates death, which has been personified. In the 30th line, he means the setting sun, which has been personified to show that it passes the speaker as human beings. Next, metaphors. You all know metaphor is an implied comparison between two different things. In line 3, the carriage is a metaphor for life's journey or passage of life that ends in death. In line 17, house is a metaphor which compares afterlife with a dwelling place or house. Next, symbols. A symbol is a sign, a shape, or an object that is used to represent something else. For example, dove is a symbol of peace. As I mentioned earlier, here children at recess symbolizes the beginning of a life, means the speaker's life. The fields of grazing grain symbolizes adolescence or adulthood, and setting sun symbolizes her final years. Next, the use of imagery. Imagery is the use of language that appeals to the reader's senses to help them imagine exactly what is being described. In this poem, Dickinson used many images from nature. They are fields of grazing grain, setting sun, dews, a house that seemed a dwelling of the ground. Dear students, now let's have a look at the form of the poem. By form, I mean the poem's type, stanza structure, line length, and rhyme scheme. First of all, this is a lyric or musical poem. Secondly, it consists of 6 stanzas having 4 lines in each stanza. These 4-line stanzas are called quatrains. Next, line length. The first and third line in each stanza is made up of 8 syllables or 4 feet. A foot is made up of on stressed and on unstressed syllable. For example, because I could not stop for death. First syllable in each foot is unstressed and second syllable is stressed. Here you see B is unstressed and cause is stressed. I is unstressed and could is stressed. Not is unstressed and stop is stressed. For is unstressed and death is a stressed syllable. These 4 feet per line is called iambic tetrameter. The second and fourth lines of each stanza are in the same iambic metrical pattern, but they have fewer syllables and therefore only 3 feet, which is called iambic trimeter. For example, he kindly stopped for me. Next, rhyme scheme. The stanzas of the poem are not perfectly rhymed, although there is a rhyme in this poem. You know, rhyming is the similarity of sounds. For example, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Here, me and immortality have a similarity in sound. Similarly, in other stanzas, the end of second and fourth lines are rhymed. These are end rhymes. However, there are internal rhymes as well. For example, look at the line number 3. Here L sound is in held and ourselves are rhymed. This is called internal rhyme. You know, alliterations are repetitions of speech sounds. Now I shall show you a number of alliterations used in this poem. They are races, ring, grazing, grain, setting, sun, gossamer, gown, tippet, tulle, horse, heads. Next, let's discuss Dickinson's style. Emily Dickinson's writing style is mostly unique. She used unconventional punctuation marks, especially capitalization and dashes, broken rhyming meter, and use of metaphors. I shall only show you the use of unconventional punctuation marks now, as I have already discussed the rhyme scheme and metaphor. If you just look at the poem, you will be able to see these unconventional punctuation marks, especially capitalization and dashes. For example, if you just look at this first stanza, you will be able to see death, carriage, ourselves, immortality are capitalized. Look at the use of dashes also at the end of the first three lines. Dear students, now I shall talk about another important aspects, the themes of this poem. You know, theme is the central idea, topic or point of a poem, story or a narrative. The poem Because I Could Not Stop for Death deals with the themes of death and immortality or eternity. Throughout the poem, Dickinson tries to find the deeper meaning of death in human life. According to Dickinson, death is not to be feared because it is a part of endless cycle of nature. And immortality or eternal life is the concept of living in physical or spiritual form for an infinite length of time. With this, I end my today's lecture and invite you to wait for my next lecture on a new topic. Till then, stay safe and continue studies. Thank you.